Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
How you doing? Khairu, how you doing? You well?
Alhamdulillah, not too bad, thanks. How are you doing? How's everything going?
Not bad, man, not bad. Just waiting for the other brothers to join. I can see Rash is just coming online now. Um, yeah, no, it's good. It's good. The hottest day in the UK so far this year. So just trying to absorb some of the heat, some of the vitamin D, shall I say.
I think we're all trying to avoid it, to be honest. It's too hot, bro.
Yeah, well, we can't be. We can't. We can never be satisfied, can't we? Sometimes it's too hot. Sometimes it's too cold. It's crazy, isn't it? It is hot. I mean, I gotta admit, it is really hot. But I think you still try to. You gotta kind of enjoy it because the fact that it's something which you're gonna get in very small doses. So it is what it is, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe we've been exposed to too much British whinging. The British are known for complaining about everything. So maybe we've inherited some of that as well.
Yeah, could be, man. Could be.
Anyway, but it is warm, definitely. But it is nice too.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Everything's a blessing, and one thing that I would say is that yes, a lot of people whinge in the UK about the weather, but the reality is that when you speak to people from other places who sometimes have like 1 or 2 seasons a year, the fact that generally you get a little bit of summer, you get an autumn, you get a spring, you get a winter. Some places it's really hot all the time. Some places it's really cold. So, alhamdulillah, it is what it is. We get a bit of everything.
To be fair, that's one of the things I love about Britain. I think the fact that we get all the seasons, every season has its own things to really enjoy. So I'm actually, it's one thing I really like about the UK.
Cool,
yeah,
man,
definitely.
cool, bro.
You know, when you're on holiday sometimes and it's really hot, and you come, you've been there maybe for a week, and you're actually looking forward to that icy cool weather. you want to breathe in that ice cool fresh air sometimes because it's just too humid, and especially when you go back home and stuff. But you can tell in these countries as well, like that your houses are built for the cold weather, because in the summer now you can't stay inside, it's so hot. So
you know what, to be honest with you, my front room, I always complain it's like a dungeon. So in the winter it's frigging freezing, right? And in the summer it is a bit cool. But listen, guys, we can continue chatting about the weather. The sort of title for our weekly roundup is what's happening Muslims. It's not what's happening weather. So let's kick on with the sort of stuff we normally speak about. There's a few segments which I think is worth discussing, which we've experienced over this last week. One sec, just let me see who's this. Okay. Right. So what I want to do is kick off with the first story, guys. And the first thing I want to chat about is the news that the top EU court rules hijab can be banned at work. Now, let me give you my perspective or some of my thoughts, and then I'll get yours and we can have a discussion. Now, to me, the issue here isn't the law itself, because from my point of view, in reality, right, the European Union Court or even the governments in the West, right, they can make such a ruling, because it's their law, it's their society. That's where I see it, right? Now, you might disagree with me about this point, but we can discuss that. Now, of course, what these types of rulings do, it does show the hypocrisy of secularism, liberalism, and no one can argue that, because it's obvious that if a system has been designed or set up by man who is limited, then it's going to be flawed from its roots, right? But as Muslims, rather, what I think is we should look beyond the law itself, and we should ask the question, right? We should ask, why is it that it's always Islam and Muslims that are being attacked, or that are, that's always in the spotlight? Now, we should ask, what's really going on here? Because in a society, right, where women can wear as less as she wants, right? People can identify themselves as the opposite gender, even animals, even plants like trees, where there's all this freedom, yet we see that there's a problem with a piece of cloth which is covering a woman's head. Now, surely, as Muslims, we got to think that there's more to this, okay? And I'm just gonna read off a part of an article that I read about this topic, and it will give you a clue of where I'm trying to go to, and then I'll get your thoughts. And what it said was that the European Union's top court has ruled that employers may forbid the wearing of visible symbols of religious or political belief, such as headscarves. Now, you probably know where I'm going from this, but I'm going to open it to you guys. Let me know your thoughts, and whether you agree with me or what you want to add to this. So yeah, go for it, guys.
I'll jump in. Really, I think you're absolutely right that we can't be surprised that they make rulings. It's their system, it's their country. They can, or their European Union, isn't it? So it's their area, their land. They can make whatever rules they want, really. So we shouldn't really be surprised. I think the point really is, though, is as you've said, they are the ones who claim to be free and liberal and give freedom of expression, freedom of choice. They're the ones that claim to be all liberal entity. So when they do rulings like this, it just shows the sheer hypocrisy that if you're claiming to be a free and liberal country and a free and liberal land, then how is it possible for you to now ban someone from wearing a cloth over their head? Because, like, as you said, wearing the as least amount of clothes possible appears to be okay. So why is it that now wearing something on your head is a problem? And I think for me that the key difference between this and some of the previous rulings we've seen around the banning of the niqab in like France and Austria and Switzerland, and I think even Sri Lanka, in various countries where they've banned the niqab, one of the main reasons they used for that was kind of identity, not being able to see the person's face, and they'd use like reasons such as security, which, to be fair, has kind of gone to the wayside due to the whole of the COVID mandatory masks and stuff like that. But having said that, this ruling here is actually nothing to do with niqab; it's to do with the hijab. So my take on this, really, as you've said, is that it is because it is Islam. It's not the cloth or the thing that someone's wearing over their head. It's because this represents Islam, and they have a problem with Islam because Islam is contradictory to their system, and it also shows that Muslims are seeking solutions from Islam as opposed to secularism. Because these two women that it was about, they actually didn't wear the hijab. First, when they were working, they didn't used to wear hijab, and then they started to wear hijab. So when they started to wear hijab, then they bought all this, they sacked them basically for wearing the hijab, and then they both bought this bogus argument of neutrality. But that really proves the point that as Muslims are getting closer to Islam and practicing Islam, this is a problem for them. This is a sign of radicalization, as they would call it. And this was the problem for them. And even in their statement, like you just read out, it says, religious or political. And I'd argue that this is a symbol of politics that they have a problem with.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, Rush, go for Rush.
Yeah, no. So just to give a different angle, because obviously I don't want to repeat what JK is saying, because I think that is one of the main issues what he's mentioned, to do with that, Muslims becoming more in line with their deen, and they see that as a threat. But just to give a slightly different angle is the fact that they've alienated their masses towards Islam, so that when someone sees someone and realizes this person's Muslim, they have a hatred for them now because of what they've been promoting. If you just see some of those images of all of the headlines on all the tabloid kind of newspapers about anti-Islam, then they've created amongst people this dislike of Islam. But now what that then does is, if they want to employ Muslims, the sister in her hijab is the most identifiable as a Muslim. A guy, okay, yes, a beard, but actually nowadays a lot of people have beards, so it's not always that easy to identify a Muslim male, whereas it's very easy to identify a practicing Muslim female because obviously the hijab. So what's happened now is they've alienated people against Islam. Now if a sister is serving you at a counter with a hijab on, or a sister is in a business working, and your populations hate Islam, all of a sudden you're fearful that a customer could come into your shop. And remember, this is capitalism now. This is a society which all they're interested in is profiting, or benefit. So what happens is, if someone comes into your store, or even in these sisters' cases, someone's leaving their children because they were care workers or working in a nursery. Yeah. So the issue is, if someone comes to that school or nursery with their children, sees a sister in hijab, has a preconceived notion that Islam is bad, it's radical. If I leave my children here, they're going to be influenced by Muslims. Then all of a sudden, all that hatred they filled in people has an effect. So can you see how it's a bit catch-22 for them? They want to instill this hatred of Islam in people, but at the same time, they're going, actually, now that we have Muslims in our midst, in our society, they want to work in our establishments, our institutions, but now we don't want them to look like Muslims. We rather they look like us, so at least people can't recognize them. And this is the other angle, I think, is where they want to make sure this idea of neutrality in the as presenting neutrality is not presenting neutrality at all. It's just making sure that someone doesn't look Muslim, because that has a negative effect, maybe on their business or on their whichever walk of life it is, just as a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, you know what? That's a really good point, to be honest with you. But before, I think Khair wants to make a point, but before you guys do, there's a voice message. So let me play it, and let's see if someone's got a comment or question. Khair, make your point. I'm just gonna see if I can play this. You carry on, make your point you're gonna make.
Yeah, sure, no worries. I think my point was just linked to what Rash was just saying there in regards to this idea of neutrality. To me, it doesn't make sense. When I heard the ruling and I read the kind of the wording that they used, I was trying to make sense of it. It makes no sense, really, because when they're saying that these companies are actually looking to present a neutral image to their customers, well, what they're actually saying is they want their employers to look non-religious in order to portray neutrality. But that's not neutral, because you're presenting an image of non-religiousness. I don't understand how you can come across neutral, because for example, if you're watching a sports game and Team A is playing Team B, and you don't have any affiliation to Team A or Team B, or in a football game, let's say, then you're a neutral supporter, aren't you? In that sense, you can say that person's a neutral. But in this situation, where either you are religious or non-religious, your outward appearance will either look as though you're either portraying yourself in a religious or non-religious way. So what is the neutral image? To me, it just sounds like they're just trying to push people away from religion.
It's bogus. Trust me, that element where it talks about neutrality is pure bogusness. That is just them trying to find a way of saying it without trying to offend people. They're trying to make, even when they cited these two sisters getting sacked, they highlighted that there was also someone who wore a cross, and therefore there was issues. So you notice this a lot of the times. Whenever they try and pass laws against something, they have to bring other things in to make it look like it's not anti-Islam. Like sometimes they'll bring a Jewish thing in when they try to do something against Islam, just to make it not look like it. Or they'll bring a right-wing thing in to when they're going against so-called terrorism.
But Rash, isn't there a rule to stop people from wearing crucifixes and stuff like this?
As a political identity.
Yeah. So for example, like these women were sacked for wearing a headscarf. I know in France it can be very strict. I don't know about other European countries, but you're saying that you give examples of other people from other religions being used as also to say, look, these people also were told off or sacked and so on. Yeah. Then couldn't somebody argue that then that the law about religious symbols is across the board?
Even if it's a law, how
The thing
have you
is,
seen? Ooh, have you seen that really be applied anywhere?
Yeah.
No,
I
think
maybe someone has an example of that, but does that, even if there are, is it enshrined that you can't wear, say, the cross, and if that is the case, is that implemented anywhere? The only places you ever seem to see it implemented is when it's referring to Muslims, but I might be wrong.
But the thing is that
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, it'd be good to give some examples, but also it could well be that someone wearing a cross, they can easily just say put it under their under their clothes, so you can't see it. But somebody who is wearing headscarf, you can't really hide headscarf, can you?
No, but it'd be interesting to see what, like, for example, Sikhs would say about this. The Sikhs wear turbans, and that's a religious symbol. It's something that those who do adhere to it would never take it off in public like that. Or, for example, the issue or the problem of, for example, nowadays non-Muslims do have long beards. It's like a bit of a trend, kind of a style thing, isn't it? Somebody could easily, a customer could say, "Oh, it's subjective, isn't it? They could see that as a religious symbol, that you have got a long beard, so you look like a Muslim." Can the employer then turn around and say, "You need to cut your beard"?
Okay, guys, I've just got a few comments I want to play. Yeah.
I agree with Rash. Despite if there are laws preventing people from wearing a cross or wearing a turban, it's still disproportionately affecting Muslims in a lot of these countries, where even when Muslims are the minority, from all the minority groups, they are still the majority.
Yeah, you can't argue with that. That's a really good point. It's got another comment to play as well, guys.
When France introduced the hijab ban, they made an exemption for Sikhs.
Okay, so I mean the thing is what I would say to that, guys, is that there's one way of looking at this in isolation, but as we know, this is a greater thing. We know that there is an intellectual struggle between Islam and non-Islam, and we know this. So when you put things into context, and the only thing I would say, and then I'm going to pass it over to Cam because I'm sure he's been wanting to say something for a while, is that the way I see it is why a piece of cloth is seen as something which is unacceptable is not because of the cloth itself, or is not even because of the notion of wanting to cover one's head. It's the fact that in a time, in an era where there's the few who dictate how society should run, what's fashionable, what isn't, what people should accept, what they shouldn't. In this time, we have people who go against that and want to worship the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're not going to follow through, this view that, women should look in this certain way, they should dress in this certain way to be acceptable and so on. This is actually going against that. And I think the fact that a Muslim woman goes against this because she's following the commands of her creator, I think for people, that's just something which is, even though they accuse others of being intolerant, I think they really burn from inside and they are intolerant towards this. Now, you can add to that if you guys want, but I just want to pass it to Cam and hear his voice, see what he's going to say.
Assalamu alaikum, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Walaikum assalam.
A couple of points I wanted to make, actually. So my original point was going to be, so recently I've joined Stereo and Clubhouse and all these other sort of voice apps where you can talk to people live. And a lot of the channels and a lot of the topics are essentially sort of the liberal movement. I find a lot of them, they're talking about, the LGBT movement. They're talking about Black Lives Matters. They're talking about all the sort of the recent liberal movements around the world that have quite a big voice these days. And one thing that was worrying me was that with this sort of ban on the hijab and ban on wearing it in the workplace, that what happens is naturally what it does is the people that also feel that form of somewhat what you call oppression in workplaces. So the LGBT movement might feel the same, or the Black Lives Matter might feel the same towards police brutality. And what it does is it pushes all these sort of minorities together to almost come together in some sort of unity. And I want to express that this is different, as in the case with Muslims. Sorry about the background noise. So the case with Muslims, we don't want to go onto the bandwagon with the rest of the sort of liberal movements. We are different. We don't agree with LGBT neither. So there's a fear that, and it really happens sort of more with the Muslim woman than the Muslim man, because obviously the Muslim woman is the one that's being targeted mainly these days. And they feel like, look, they've got a friend now in the LGBTQ community that sides with them and feels their pain in some form or another, and then they start siding with them in their marches and their demonstrations and their talks, and that goes against Islam entirely, and it basically throws your values into the bin, and you've got nothing to stand on now because you're sort of neither here nor there. So that was one of my first points. I think the fear of that, and I think we need to stress that we shouldn't move into those other wings and form some sort of coalition or unity to shout out against the oppression on us. We stick as Muslims with our values, and if the only people that hold our certain values are other Muslims. So there's naturally never going to be a unity with anyone other than another Muslim. So that's my first point. And my second point was where they mention it's a neutral identity. It's not neutral at all. What they need to term it is secular identity, and that's why they may target the person with an outward cross, because I don't believe. I think there is a law on the cross, and it's based on the certain size of the cross. So if you've got a very, very large cross and it's hanging in front of your neck in a workplace, that is frowned upon in most Western countries still, and that's why they introduced the tie. And that was a formal way of saying you're Christian, but you're not wearing a cross in the workplace. And I think it's a secular identity they're trying to push. And the reason it affects Muslims the most is because there's no denying that since 9/11, there's been an Islamic revival. The youth of the Muslim, they call it the youth bulge in the Arab world, because there's more youth than there are elderly. There's an Islamification, an Islamic revival going on, whereby they feel their identity is being lost in terms of their national identity and going towards sort of an Islamic unity identity. And that naturally will come across in all these other workplaces around the West. And that's why it feels like Muslims are being overly targeted. I would bet a dime and a dollar that if it was a Christian revival happening today and there was a lot of people becoming very, very Christian and following to the book, then they would also be attacked by the seculars. But the fact is, there is no Christian revival in that sense. It's an Islamic revival in this 20th century, and that's why the Muslims are being targeted.
Really
nice.
good points.
Yeah, Jake, you want to say something? Go for it.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say, all the brothers have made some really, really interesting points. Couldn't agree anymore, to be fair, with some of the points that Cam just made. Just to add, though, the first point he made about, there's this concept of allyship between the liberals. So this is the idea that, like Cam said, the minorities kind of form an alliance together. And I think just to avoid repeating, but make a separate point, but slightly linked, is that when it comes to even the Muslim woman wearing the hijab, it's very important that the reason the Muslim woman is wearing the hijab or following any Islamic rule for that matter, that needs to be watertight. That needs to be clear to every Muslim that we follow the rules of Islam, the rules of Allah, because it's a command from Allah. Allah commands the woman to wear the hijab, and it's not anything to do with it's my choice, it's my body. And there's various hashtags that go around about my body, my choice, and all of these hashtags that go around that really promote the liberal idea that a Muslim woman chooses to wear the hijab because it's part of her freedom. And that's not the angle that we need to take as Muslims. And that, it might sound like I'm just talking about the hijab, but it's for every rule in Islam. We follow the Islamic rules because Allah has obliged us to follow these rules. And we know that Islam is the truth and the Quran is the truth, and that is from Allah. So we will follow it and obey Allah because we know that the Quran can be proven to be the word of Allah. So I think that's a very, very important thing that we need to promote with this, that even though there's some kind of hatred and a targeting of Muslim women, we need to stick to our values and recognize that we follow the rules of Allah, whether it be hijab or anything else, because we're obeying the laws of Allah. And then secondly, just to link to Cam's second point about this whole secularization, I think he's totally right that yes, they are targeting Muslims because they view that Islam is the threat. Islam is what's clashing with secularism, not any other religion. And it is about secularization. They don't want any sort of religious symbol to be kind of promoted heavily in the workplace or in the public sphere. And if it did, they will clamp it down. But what they're finding, and what Cam said, is totally true, that it's because Islam is the only deen, the only religion that is showing, putting up a battle with secularism. Every other religion has caved in. Every other religion has become secularized, and Islam is the only one that is still standing up strong.
Yeah, I watched this video and there's this Christian guy and he's talking about Islam and basically saying, like, in the future, if I was to choose a religion, I'd put my money on Islam, because what he was saying is, look, Islam is intolerant, but he clarified, he explained what he meant. He didn't mean that in a bad way. You say, look at all the other religions, they have changed. So what we've seen is with Christianity, for example, after the Renaissance period and so on, for the church to stay relevant, it's had to change rules. It's had to change the way Christianity is just to stay relevant in modern times. Had it not done that, it would probably be finished. I mean, already you're seeing churches being converted into mosques or shops and so on. It's because there's this idea that Christianity now isn't here for the modern world. And what he was saying is about Islam sticks by its guns, and it's not changing. It's not trying to conform to fit the reality. And as we know, Islam came to change the reality. So I think that adds to that point as well.
To give an example of that, I don't know if anybody's been following this in the last few years. With all this SRE, sex and relationship education, that's been being taught in schools now, it was the Muslims that had a backlash against it, big, especially in some of the Muslim majority cities. So it's like Birmingham and places like that. So what happened when it was discussed that children as young as between 4 and 6 would be taught about masturbation and things like that, it was the Muslims who all came forward saying, we're going to remove our children from schools because we're not happy about this kind of, even the LGBT side that Cam mentioned. If you're going to start teaching our children that it's suddenly okay to come home and identify as the opposite gender, then this is completely against our religion and we don't accept this. But what happened at the same time, I don't know if you heard, is there was a number of Christian and Jewish people that came to some of these rallies and said, you know what, we feel that we've given up our way of life because we conceded, just like you've said, we conceded to all of this and we allowed reformation in our churches, which is why our way of, our Christianity is dying. And we're just conforming, we're becoming pragmatic, and look at this, they're now influencing our children, we've got gay priests, all of these kind of things. We're losing our religion, whereas we now look at you and say, actually, you guys, like you called it, stood by your guns, or you stood by your principles, and they looked up to the Muslims because they said, well, at least they don't change as the wind changes, and that you've seen quite a bit in the last couple of years in the UK.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I've there's a hairdresser, my normal hairdresser that I go to, and he's a Christian guy, and I always chat to him about Islam and stuff. And he said the same thing, man. He said, look, he goes, and he called it the satanic game. And he's saying, like, he's saying the only thing now, the only people, the only ideology, the only way of life that is standing against the satanic plans for the world is Islam and Muslims. And that's why I think Cam made a very good point, that if tomorrow Christians said, actually, you know what, let's go back to the scriptures, let's go back to how it should have been. they would also, feel they would also be marginalized. They would be clamped down on as well. At this moment in time, it just goes to show that, it is Islam who is carrying the flag. And if you speak to people from different religions, they will be the first to say that, what, like you said, Rash, they will say, what, we allowed it, we became fluid. And look, and this is what that guy was saying on that show. And I know you guys have watched that clip, and he was saying, look, now we know in Christianity homosexuality is not allowed, but now we have homosexual priests. Forget just like accepting homosexuality. So, it just goes to show that you see why there's a struggle, because of the fact that as Muslims, we have a system, we have a life, we have a way of life, shall I say, that doesn't just deal with the spiritual matters, it deals with political matters. It doesn't just deal with private matters, it deals with matters of society and public. And as Muslims, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, that when Allah and His Messenger have decided a matter, it's not fit for a believing man or woman to have any say in this. So this is our aqeedah. We're Muslims, we are the ones who submit. So we submit to the entirety of Islam. Hence why the resistance will only come, hence why Islam is the only target in this modern times, and the resistance is only with the Muslims, because we cannot let these things go. Otherwise, we would cease to be Muslims, and we wouldn't be following the deen of Islam.
There's the verse as well, isn't it? That fits exactly in line with what you just said. It says they will never be pleased with you unless you follow them in their way. So unless you completely leave your religion and follow theirs. So even if it's just dress or whatever it is, they'll never be pleased with you until you completely leave your Islam.
Yeah, man. No, that's true. And one thing I'd like to say, and then move on to the next segment, guys, is I feel that, non-Muslims that that live in the West, I think they also have a responsibility, because if they believe in liberalism and freedom and so on, that they should think, actually, wait a minute, if we say we're the champions of freedom and we're champions of liberalism and so on, right? Then how does it make sense that we can stop someone from carrying certain ideas or dressing in a certain way? You understand? Because even the I can't remember the term. I think it's called the harm factor, where when the philosophers were speaking about freedom, and they're saying that you're free until you harm someone else. Now, in reality, a woman who's wearing a headscarf, in reality, she's not harming anyone. I would argue that a woman that's wearing next to nothing is more harmful, right? Because that could lead to loads of things that can happen which are not correct, right? So it's just for people out there should actually think and question and think, why is this? Why is there this hypocrisy? And I feel people, especially those who see themselves as being, free thinkers and free souls, they should ask that, why is there such hypocrisy? Because if they don't, then they are part of the problem, I believe. But okay, guys, let's move on to the next segment, inshallah. And this one, I just wanted to get your thoughts. It was an interesting issue that has been happening in the last couple of weeks, where some people are saying that what's emerging is a rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the Emiratis. Now, what we've seen is that there's been an issue between them revolving around the production quota of oil, right? And there's been an issue with Saudi and Russia on one side, and the Emiratis on the other side, in regards to the Emiratis insisting on increasing its quota from 3.2 to 3.8 million barrels per day. Now, Saudis rejected this initiative, and in fact, it's imposed a host of economic sanctions on the Emirati free zones, such as imposing tariffs on Saudi-destined Emirati goods, which totals around $10 billion. So it's not a joke, right? And also we saw Saudi suspend the movement of Saudi travelers to the UAE and called on Saudi nationals in the UAE to return home. And this Saudi decision is set to cause major losses to the UAE, which welcomes about 2 million Saudi tourists each year. So you can imagine how much financially this is going to affect them. So the question I want to ask you guys, get your thoughts on this, is that from my point of view, we've seen that Saudi and the UAE have worked together in places like Yemen. And we also know that Saudi and UAE, these governments are puppet states or are controlled by the Americans. But then, doesn't this issue between these two countries cause a problem for America in the region in order to for it to achieve its political ambitions? So what do you guys think?
My thoughts on this, as you said, it was a public spat, a public dispute between the two nations that are generally seen as being like very close allies. They've worked, like I said, they worked together in various agendas that the US really has been pushing. There's differences obviously between the two nations, but increasingly Saudi is kind of challenging the UAE to become a bit more like it in terms of it becoming a tourist industry, and they have a bit of a rivalry, you could call it, and I think this is that's basically what it was. It was a bit of economic rivalry between the countries, because as you guys will know that Saudi. They have a plan called the Vision 2030 plan. And that plan basically, on the kind of face of it, it's meant to be a means for Saudi to seek a different source of income, a different source of wealth, other than kind of the generic oil wealth that they receive. And the wealth that they receive through the Hajj pilgrimage that obviously we're going through right now. Hajj started today. So this Vision 2030 was about modernizing the economy, finding different sources of income, which was increasingly kind of tourism, technological sector as well. So you may have heard of the NEOM project or the NEOM City project that was in Jeddah. So Saudi had the plan to have this kind of very modern, liberal city in Jeddah on the coast of the sea. Which would kind of have
it's not Jeddah. I think it's Tabuk. It's in Tabuk,
oh, sorry,
region.
Tabuk, yeah, near the Red Sea, right?
Yeah,
near the Red Sea, Tabuk. You're right. This basically they were calling for trying to attract the Western audience as well to come and visit Saudi, and they do this through various kind of you could call Western entertainment. So they were inviting large kind of mega stars basically in music and dance. You guys will know that they invited Nicki Minaj, who's meant to be this bigger kind of superstar in music, but obviously controversial because she's controversial because obviously she wears next to no clothes and very much promotes the sexualization of the woman. So obviously goes against Islam. And if Saudi is meant to be a nation that is meant to be based on Islam and the two, custodian of the two holy mosques, this causes a bit of contradiction, and it did cause a bit of dispute. People did start to question what Saudi were doing. So anyway, the point I'm making is that Saudi are trying to rival the UAE. So when it came to this crisis here, the OPEC crisis, basically because of the pandemic, OPEC, who's about I think 26 countries, I think, who produce oil, they decided to kind of reduce the production of oil. But then Saudi said they're going to ramp it up a little bit. But
you're breaking up, bro.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me better now?
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, Karen, you're breaking up a bit.
Okay, the point really I wanted to make
Unless
is that
me. Yeah, Karen, bro.
So the OPEC problem was that the UAE decided to kind of challenge Saudi because the way the plan that they had in increasing the production wasn't fast enough. So this is what caused a rift. However, we know that this is a temporary rift because now it's been resolved. More recently, only over the couple of days, it's been resolved now. And Saudi came to a compromise with the UAE to up the production so that it would benefit the UAE and the other countries as well. So this really shows that it was a temporary rift. It wasn't this major political rift that would cause a long-term damage to the relationship, but rather it was a temporary thing, and it really just highlighting the rivalry that the two countries really have.
Okay. Rash, any comments on that?
No, I would just say that at the end of the day, we know what these rulers of these, especially these two nations, nation states, what they love. They love wealth, and their priority number one is making sure they are the main guardians of that wealth. we hear about how there's disputes between the king and the sons and all of these kind of things, and it's always about wealth, it's always about power. So this latest episode, again, I think it's like JK has mentioned, it's economic. They are still, dogs of America. They are still implementing the plans of America, but it just so happens that they need to diversify their income. At the end of the day, they recognize that at some point they're not going to be able to continue just pumping this oil out. And as soon as that oil dries up, they need to be able to still be relevant. If they don't have the wealth, what use are they to their masters? Yeah. So the more wealth they have, the more on top of things they are, the higher their position is in terms of being able to help America and the Western states carry out their objectives in the Middle East, the more relevant they remain. And I think this was just a dispute to remain relevant from an economic point of view, personally, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, some good points there. I think the only thing I would say is something building on what JK said about, he mentioned about Saudi's plans of trying to change the way its resources purely from oil and gas, or I think just oil, to entertainment sector and so on. I think the only thing I would add to that is the fact that what we can see is if America's plan is to spread secularism throughout the world, spread its own ideology, then UAE does give it some sort of an example of a place which is supposed to be free and so on within that land. But the reality is that Saudi Arabia is always seen as the leaders of certainly the Sunni Islamic world, mainly because of Mecca and Medina. So if these plans of NEOM, the city NEOM, or whether it's Vision 2030, if Saudi goes down this route, and we can see recently, without going into too much detail, about some laws being changed, I think that their goal, if they were to choose between the UAE and Saudi in regards to who they want to be the leaders in that region, I think it's going to have to be Saudi because of what they actually represent. Yeah, so I mean, let's quickly move on. It's good to get your thoughts on that. I just want to quickly move on to the last section, and get your thoughts. It's something really interesting that I came across, and I read an article, and it said, and there's titled "How British pro-Israeli groups are rewriting Middle East history textbooks," and I'm going to quickly just read a little bit out from this article because it's really interesting. It says, for the second time in 2 years, a major international education company has withdrawn 2 British school textbooks on Middle East history in response to accusations of bias regarding their Israel-Palestine content. Pearson, which also oversees national exams for 14 to 16-year-olds in the UK, announced the decision on June the 8th after an independent review by 2 British academics found dangerously misleading pro-Israel bias in the books. And from what some of the guys have said, some people who, like, there's a guy called John Chalcroft. He's a professor of Middle East history and politics, right, at the London School of Economics. He undertook a line-by-line study of the textbooks, the originals, and what now the more up-to-date versions, right? And what he said was that the extraordinary number of changes made to the books, the study concludes, transformed the texts into propaganda under the guise of education. Now, there's loads of other stuff which is in there. I'll probably mention it if it's need be, but I find this very, very interesting. And here, what we're talking about is these books were not just bedtime story books. These books were the books that were studied for the GCSE exams. What are your thoughts on this, brothers?
You know what's interesting about this is this news like this normally goes under the radar. Most people probably don't even hear about it because, like you say, it doesn't get mainstream media attention. But I've had the same thought as the way you're surprised by it. I have that same thought in that this is extremely important. And that's why people need to be speaking about it, because there's a few factors here. Firstly, it's not just some random books that are pro-Israel. This is Pearson publish a lot of books, yeah, and they're a major publisher and they're a major influencer in curriculum as well. You know, when you have curriculum and you have institutions and you have people who check people's grades, and all of that forms part of academia as a nation. And for them to influence, and the key part of this story isn't just the fact that some of these books were initially removed because they were deemed as pro-Israel when it comes to the Israel-Palestine so-called conflict. It's not a conflict, it's a one-way, as we've discussed many times previously, but as they call it, conflict. On this topic, these books were supposedly pro-Israel, yeah? But then they were able to make them like 1 million times more pro-Israel without pretty much initially anybody saying anything. So how is it that a major publisher like this was able to have their books firstly retracted, then independently reviewed, but then made so much more pro-Israel that someone had to comment, as you mentioned, that it became propaganda under the guise of education? How was that even possible? And on top of that, how is it possible for them to put their reputation on the line? So how much power does the pro-Israeli lobby in the UK have? And we know it has influence, massive influence on the major parties in the UK, especially the Tories. Yeah. So how is it that a pro-Israeli lobby is able to have such a huge influence that they're able to get people to change these books, and not just people, these major publishers, to be so pro-Israeli that it whitewashes completely the Palestinian what's it called?
Cause?
Cause. Well, the Palestinian cause and their resistance. Yeah, it whitewashes that resistance. So I think it's extremely important, and I'm glad you raised that, and I'll be interested to hear some of the other brothers' thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, whilst they're gonna say some, I just add, Rash, a really good point you made at the beginning was this is not mainstream news. This is not something which you're gonna hear. And what shocked me was, bro, is like you're saying, how did this manage to happen, especially in GCSE textbooks? And what the guy said was that John Chalcraft, he said that the alterations were so numerous, so blatantly one-sided, so disproportionately designed to exonerate Israel, that it does allow one to be a little surprised that a reputable international publisher would preside over such a process for a GCSE textbook. And it just goes to show that there's so much, people are fearful, because now if somebody was to come out and maybe argue with this, you know what's going to happen. They're going to be seen as being called anti-Semitic. They're going to have people destroying their reputation, and it's not fair, because look, we know the issue of Judaism is a religion. Okay, it has, and if people were to criticize the acts of the state of Israel, that's not making them anti-Semitic. And even Jews themselves will come out and say, I was listening actually to an interview yesterday on YouTube where there was a Jew who called into, I think it's James O'Brien, and he was saying that, what I feel bad that I have to answer for the actions of Israel, even though I'm in Britain and I'm British. And it's funny because James O'Brien did say, well, this is very normal for Muslims. But what he did say that maybe it's because Israel is seen as the homeland for Jews. So whoever is, Jewish is linked to Israel, but Jews themselves will not accept this. So I just think that, for me, it was good to get your thoughts, and it would be good to hear what the other brothers, if they have any comments on this. It was something which really surprised, that even the tweaks in some of the examples they gave, for example, in one example, it talked about the 1948 Deir Yassin massacre, in which in the original book it said one of the worst atrocities of the 1948 war, which it wasn't a war, but okay. In the revised edition, the word atrocities is replaced by acts.
Well, but do you know what? That one's bad, but I think the other one's even worse, because at least one someone might say is subjective, because it's terminology, isn't it? When you have terminology, someone can use different superlatives Yeah, you can say something's bad, something's awful, something's extremely bad. So you can have superlatives. Yeah. The other ones I found really interesting. You know where it said international law states that a country cannot annex and or indefinitely occupy territory gained by force.
Yeah.
By them changing that to add at the front, some argue, that becomes factually incorrect. So now you're talking about a publication where they're putting these publications into schools, remember? Putting them into schools. And I think there's a point I want to quickly make about that in a second, but a publication that goes into schools that thousands of children read, by now putting the word some argue in there, you're undoing your own systems. You're undoing your own constitution. You know, the so-called these human rights laws. You've said that, you highlight that, you know, it's part of international law. As soon as you add the word some argue in front of it, all of a sudden it's disputable. And that's where it becomes factually incorrect. And when something's factually incorrect, you can't start teaching people factually incorrect stuff, which we know they do in these countries anyway, because there's the British version of the truth, or the victors of history, their version of the truth. But this is extremely blatant. And my other very quick point about the being in schools is, I think it's important to understand that these kind of issues are generational. The reason why this is done in a school level is they want to make sure the future generation of children coming out of schools have already been ingrained in a certain way. That's why the academic system in much of the Western world tries to keep children as children up until the age of like 18, 21. They see it as the longer they stay in academia, the more we can brainwash them into thinking a certain way, so that when they come out, they're perfect for the capitalist model. They're perfect as laborers that can just go out into society. We've taught them how to think, and now they live amongst the masses, spreading our ideology. Whereas we know in history, especially under Islam, by teaching people the correct stance and proper critical thinking, you can go out in society and you can break down all the false narratives and false thoughts, whereas you don't see that as much in the Western world.
Yeah, sure, man. Sure, some deep points, bro. Some deep points. I'd like to hear anything else from the other guys, and if not, we can sort of like...
I'll make a quick point. With this, these sort of tactics of changing curriculum over time to suit their vision or their ideology, this is something that has been this came about at the very start of their Renaissance and their plan for the future. And even early philosophers like Machiavelli, and you hear the term Machiavellian, or however you pronounce it, that generally means something so bizarre and so brazen in politics that you wouldn't have thought it's going to be accepted. And this is these sort of Machiavellian sort of actions that they do, that you think, how do they get away with it? But it's still sort of, there's never any backlash, and life goes on, and everyone is brainwashed all the same. And what they called it, and even Machiavelli himself in his book back in the 1500s would refer to it as cultural hegemony. So it's not just military. When you think of hegemony, you think of like a military hegemony and people, powers that have ruled over parts of the world through force. But that changed since the US became the superpower. They have now supremacy over the world, and the only way they're going to maintain their supremacy is changing the culture of those countries that, or those nations that they've passed their ideology on, or that they're subduing. And this cultural hegemony would include changing the curriculum to suit the ideology that they're trying to push, or even just suit them getting more and more capital. Because sometimes you have to realize that it's not about America or Britain or whoever the power is at the time wanting those nations to be like them or become the white man or anything like that. It's more of a case of we can take what we can from this land, and without causing a war or causing any issue on our own power base. So if that means changing some of the curriculum to you know, it might even go against our own freedoms and our own democracy and our own beliefs. If it's happening outside of our land, then it's okay, because it's all about, you know, bringing that capital back home to us. So there's this term of cultural hegemony, and that's going to continue until while America are still the superpower, and while they have their puppets around the world to push their narrative, and while they've still got their mass media also controlling most of the world. And you'll also find in most of the porous countries, rather, not poorer worlds, you'll find that they actually brand a lot of their NGOs very similarly all over the world, and most namely are the radio stations like Free, where they've got the word term free before the radio. And these are all American-based radio stations, all disguising almost themselves as local stations, but really all the narrative and all the advertisements and all the cultural changes that they're making, they're all the culture of the American ideology.
Yeah, some really top points there, bro.
Just a super quick one from me. Imagine the same thing happened where there was some books that go to students for their GCSEs that were massively pro-Hitler and pro the Nazis. All of a sudden, that would be mainstream news. That would be, everybody would be talking about that. How is it possible that you guys are teaching our children Nazism and things like that? So why is it any different that in the modern world, the you know, this illegitimate state of Israel, this state which is oppressing, you know, Muslims left, right, and center, killing innocent children? How is it possible that you can start publishing books that are completely, like I said earlier, whitewashing and making them be an acceptable entity, even though it goes against their own international laws, and it not be in mainstream media, and it's stuck on, you know, this magazine that has done an article on it, yet none of the mainstream media has highlighted it at all. Unless anybody's seen it, I haven't seen it in any other mainstream media.
No, not really. But what's interesting is the latest escalations that we saw a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, between Israel and Palestine. A lot of there was a lot of backlash in schools from young children, wasn't there? You saw a lot of protesting, taking down of Israeli flags, challenging of what Israel are doing, and teachers were struggling to hold, to contain that, and they were even lying to the children when they were responding, making up blatant lies, because the teachers themselves don't understand the whole situation. So it's quite interesting that this has come out after that, because I've not noticed that in previous escalations where the Muslim children in schools were kind of taking a very firm stance on this, which was a really promising sight to see, actually.
Yeah, just to add my 2 pence to this as well, I think what it really highlights is the importance of us ensuring that, many of us will have children, making sure that we kind of re-educate our children, because the reality is that, as Cam and Rash have been saying as well, that the dominant system will always promote their angle, their idea, and that will be through the education system, because that's part of their infrastructure. That will be through other infrastructure such as the legal system, and also the media. So this is their way of promoting their propaganda, and it's interesting that they call this propaganda, because many people will view education as being neutral and being not taking any sides. And interestingly, we were talking about neutrality earlier as well, but actually the education system of the West will always promote their angle, and they will promote their side of the truth, so-called truth. So it's really important that as Muslim parents, we recognize that our children spend most of their time watching the media, whether it be kind of Netflix and TV programs, and then they spend a lot of time in the education system as well. So if our children are spending so much time under their education and their influence, we need to counteract that by making sure that we tell them the truth of what happened in Palestine and what happened in the Muslim world, and make sure that they do challenge back when they come up with these false narratives.
It's not even about our children, is it, though? If you think about it, yes,
Yeah,
that's our
true.
priority, but it's about
Everyone.
everyone. You know, even if there's any people that are not Muslim that are listening, they need to recognize that their children are being institutionalized into false narratives. So you don't
Yeah.
want your child to go to school and then come home with the false narrative, because a day will come when he's up against someone else discussing something or promoting something where he's completely on the side of the falsehood or in what is incorrect rather than on the side of the truth. No parent, be it Muslim or non-Muslim, wants their children to come home having been indoctrinated in falsehood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Good point.
100%, man. Can't argue with you guys. But brothers, it's inshallah what we're gonna do is come to the sort of end of the weekly roundup. Some fantastic points. Normally, Rash does a plug, but I'll do it this time. That a lot of the things that we discussed today, we do have another podcast called the Talking Deen podcast, which can be found on YouTube under the heading of Voice of the Ummah, and also it can be found on all popular podcast platforms. We've spoken about these topics in the past, whether it's about Palestine and so on. So definitely, for the people listening, go and check that out. So yeah, really big up, Jazakallah. Big thanks to you guys, the Kashem crew, who have come on and really made their points, really top points, and contributed to the discussion. Also, as well, for comments made by Afi and also Cyanide Snow Cone. Really good points there as well. So yeah, inshallah, brothers, for this week, let's call it an end, or call it a week, shall I say, and hopefully we can do this again next week.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, brothers, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Salam.
Salam.